As soon as he returned to the day before the apocalypse, the first thing our protagonist did was to slaughter all the cows on his family's farm. Those animals represented his family's entire livelihood. While he was carrying out the slaughter, the villagers who witnessed the scene were dumbfounded, whispering that the man was the weakest patient from the asylum. His ex-girlfriend was nearby, and thinking he was doing all this for her, she began to mock him, saying that even if he sold all those cows, it still wouldn't be enough to cover her 100,000 dowry, and besides, she had already found a tycoon boyfriend to replace him, so he'd better stop. But before she could finish, our protagonist simply told her to get lost, as he didn't have time to waste on any cow that wasn't from his farm. You might be thinking he's just a lunatic, but no, my friends, he was desperate, because only he knew that in about 3 hours, a terrible climate would form, and the world would go to hell. Show explains to us that the end wouldn't start with humans, but with animals, where the cattle would mutate first, becoming bloodthirsty and attacking any living being, and that subsequently, the virus would spread to humans faster than anyone could imagine. And in a month, the world as they knew it would be over. He remembers that in his previous life, he helplessly watched his family die before his eyes, but this time he swore that wouldn't happen. At that moment, Joe's parents arrived and panicked, thinking their son had gone crazy. His father shouted, asking what the hell he was doing, begging them to have a word before the situation became irreversible, as they needed the cattle to stay alive. The moment Joe heard his parents, he froze and let the knife fall from his hand. Then he ran to his parents with a trembling voice, thanking them with all his might for being by his side, while vowing that he would protect them no matter what. His parents stared at him, completely confused by his strange behavior, while their son expressed that there was no time to explain, and that the only thing they needed was to trust him, saying that they needed to slaughter all the cattle and sell the meat, explaining that every fraction of a second mattered. His father looked into his son's eyes and hesitated for a moment, but agreed, saying it was okay, as he trusted his son. Since his son was the only college graduate in the village, his father thought that if he was so serious, he must know something they didn't. His mother let out a long sigh, rolled up her sleeves, and silently joined the slaughter, while the entire neighborhood watched the commotion in perplexity. At that moment, Joe checked the time and realized that there were only a few hours left before everything fell apart, and with that he turned to the crowd and shouted, saying he needed 3 guys to help slaughter the cattle, saying he would pay $500 each. Some men who were adrift, upon hearing this offer, instantly perked up, pushing and shouting at each other for a chance to earn quick money. Without wasting a second, Jojo called a local butcher and sold all the meat for half the price with the condition that the payment should be in cash and quick. His parents watched somewhat desperately as the cows they had raised for a lifetime were reduced to meat and money in such a short time. To make matters worse, our protagonist didn't even give them an explanation, just stuffing the money into his bag and saying he needed to go to the city. Before leaving, he turned and begged them to stay inside the house and not open the gate for anything in this world until he returned. With that, he squeezed into the pickup truck and sped off. And at his first pit stop, he bought everything he could find for self-defense. Next, he went to the pharmacy, emptying the shelves of all emergency supplies and stock. However, there was still one thing Jojo needed more than anything else: gunpowder, because he knew that at the beginning of the world's downfall, whoever had firepower would be in control. He took the rest of the money to a small factory that apparently manufactured fireworks, but behind the scenes, they traded gunpowder illegally. And what is the irony of fate? The man who owns this dump is none other than Lin Ji, the rich boyfriend his ex-girlfriend had found. Upon arriving there, Jojo entered and threw his bag full of money on the table, while Lin Ji raised an eyebrow, then burst into laughter, asking if the bull was angry or what, asking if he was trying to win back his ex-girlfriend or something. But our protagonist, with balls of steel, just went straight to the point, saying he was there on business, as he had 100,000 in his bag and wanted to buy his gunpowder. At that moment, the greasy smile froze on Linji's face and his tone changed, saying that they were a legitimate business and didn't deal with anything suspicious. Jojo smiled ironically, asking if he was sure because last year, they found a woman in a blue coat near the back mountain, asking if he should dig her up and ask what really happened there. At that moment, almost Linji's soul left his body. Such was the nervousness the man faced. After a long pause, he turned to the woman beside him and asked her to take him to the warehouse. As Jojo left, Linjie leaned back, laughing nervously, while thinking that unfortunately someone knew about his secret, reflecting that this person couldn't last long. After this unpleasant encounter, Jojo returned home with his supplies and quickly called his older brother to help unload, but his brother had bad news, mentioning that his younger sister, who studied in the city, hadn't returned yet. At that moment, Jojo froze, because in his past life, she would already be home by this time, questioning if his early actions might have triggered a butterfly effect, and to make matters worse, there were only 30 minutes left before the outbreak began. Without saying anything else, he jumped back into the pickup truck and sped towards the city, begging them not to leave the house and that no matter what, they shouldn't open the gate for anyone. The tires screeched as he slammed on the accelerator, racing towards the school. He knew that most infections on the first day started with animals, but schools were crowded with people, and once it got there, chaos would ensue. Suddenly, the pickup truck shook violently, as if it had hit something, and Jojo braked sharply and jumped out to check. At that moment, he saw a terrifying mutant dog in the road writhing, while its eyes glowed blood red and its fangs dripped a thick black liquid. In other words, things had already gone bad. Meanwhile, the news of Jojo slaughtering the cattle had already spread through Qingshan High School, and his younger sister, whose name is Zhou Ying, was labeled the school freak. In class, Li Xiaoya saw Zhou Ying remain silent and became even more malicious with every word she uttered. And while waving her cell phone, she mocked, saying that her family was crazy and that her college brother had killed all their cows just to marry some village girl, labeling the action as pathetic. Ying got angry, slamming her hand on the desk and knocking Li Xiaoya's cell phone out of her hand, and at that instant, the teacher entered, saw the mess, and confiscated the cell phone without saying a word. After class, while Zhou Ying stayed to clean up, Li Xiaoya came over and pushed her to the ground, pulling out a box cutter, saying that she broke her cell phone, so it was time to pay for it. But before she could make her next move, her body began to convulse, and a jet of black blood spurted from her mouth. She collapsed, choking and vomiting uncontrollably, while Ying screamed and ran terrified towards the hallway, only to discover that the entire school was already in chaos, where screams of pain, calls for help, and everything else could be heard from all sides. Zhou Ying barely had time to process what was happening until a zombified classmate with bulging eyes and a torn mouth lunged at her. She then fell in terror, and her fall saved her as the zombie missed its pounce, falling face first onto the floor with a sickening thud. At that instant, Li Xiaoya staggered out of the classroom, now completely transformed, her body contorting unnaturally, and a grotesque smile plastered on her face. She screamed and lunged straight at Ying, but just before things went bad, we see that things went well. Because our protagonist arrived just in time, landing a flying kick that sent the zombie flying down the hallway. Breaking a window, the other zombie got up and he didn't hesitate. Drawing his knife with a swift movement and with a single strike, the zombie's head hit the ground before its body. Joe turned and saw his little sister, and saw that she was trembling and crying. And to try to lighten the mood, he mentioned that he could hear her screams from another planet, and invited her to get out of there, as there was no time to waste. And with that, they headed to the parking lot. Inside the car, Ying forced a smile, mentioning that it was intense, wondering if they were participating in some kind of horror reality show or something, while her brother simply replied gently that it was okay to be scared and cry, and that the world was unfortunately changing, and they would need to adapt to it, saying then that their mother, father, and older brother were home and safe. This statement makes Ying give a slight smile of relief, but I have my doubts if everything is really okay there. But we'll find out soon, because back in the village, under the illusion of peace, we see that danger was already looming. Upon arriving home, they were able to confirm that luckily, everyone was safe, while Xiao explained that he would need to go out once more to find someone. His mother began to protest, but Ying intervened, telling her to let him go with a calm and resolute voice, because the girl whose life had been saved by a hair's breadth now perfectly understood that her brother was no longer the same as before. And his sister was right, because Zhao could really feel something stirring inside him. A strange and growing power that emanated from the inner chaos. A raw, untamed power full of possibilities. His thoughts then turned to a figure from his past life. Someone who crossed the zombie tide like a ghost, thinking that if he could find that person in this life, that person would be an invaluable ally. Meanwhile, inside the village committee building, Xiao Xia leaned against the door with all her might. She still believed that the residents were merely panicking, not fully understanding the threat. Suddenly, a large hand with a grayish-blue hue broke through the wooden door, and seconds later, bloodied zombies forced their way in, growling. The officials inside were paralyzed with terror, and just when all hope seemed lost, the window shattered and we see our protagonist dive through it, his blade flashing as he worked, and as a result, the zombies fell one after another. He rushed to Xiao Xia's side, gently holding her face and checking for any signs of infection, and when he saw no blood or bite marks, he let out a sigh of relief, for this was the woman who, in his past life, was cold, authoritarian, and almost untouchable, yet now she seemed fragile, almost human. At that instant, the man with glasses shouted, asking why he had killed them, mentioning that they were their neighbors, people they had lived with for years. Xiao inhaled slowly, trying to remain calm, and replied that they were no longer human, and that one bite or even a drop of infected blood was all it took for tragedy to strike, and that now they were nothing more than zombies. The man adjusted his glasses, uttering the word, "Zombies." That was old Huang. He was just looking for his missing granddaughter, saying that they should call the police and let the authorities handle it. At that moment, the imbecile Lin Ji came out of the back room, clapping slowly with a smug smile, mentioning that he was a really tough guy, asking him what the next step was. Dripping with irony, he asked if the government was also part of a conspiracy or something, saying that this zombie stuff was just idle talk. With that, he began to incite the people around them to have him arrested, and the crowd actually started to get riled up and demand our protagonist's head. However, before things went bad, Xia Bingbing spoke up and said that she saw with her own eyes that Xiao Zhou had saved everyone's asses. At that moment, our protagonist looked at her with gratitude, and then mentioned with conviction that if they still didn't believe him, he could show them the truth, saying that they could go to the forest behind the mountain. Lin Ji's eyes narrowed, as he had already noticed Zhao's strange behavior in the city, stocking up on weapons and supplies, and now he was almost certain that this guy knew something, thinking that if Zhao had anything that could expose him, then he had to go, no matter what. With a fake smile, he gathered some of his thugs and said he would go along as a precaution, while Xia and Huang Tao also offered to go. She was worried about the residents, and Huang Tao still had no news of his missing wife. The village chief had left earlier that day to investigate the disappearances and had not returned. When the group reached the back mountain, they quickly found the village secretary's abandoned vehicle parked near the forest. Zia touched the hood, still warm. Mentioning that he hadn't been gone long, she murmured, her eyes half closed. Fragments of our protagonist's past life memories then began to fall into place, and he remembered that if things unfolded the same way, this forest could be the epicenter of the first zombie outbreak. But even after searching the entire mountain, the group found nothing. This obviously lasted until Xiao noticed a strange cave entrance hidden among the rocks, where the ground was stained with blood, and the air reeked of decay, and everything suggested that zombies had passed through there. Xiao mentioned that he would go in alone to check, precisely so as not to put more people in danger. But Lin Ji scoffed, immediately throwing a jab, asking if he was just trying to clean up some evidence from the place. Our protagonist then completely lost his patience and, in a dry and direct manner, asked him to come along since he was the brave lord who wasn't afraid of anything. The moment Xiao took a step towards the cave, a figure leaped from the shadows, while Huang Tao cried out in joy, calling her Axin as she was his missing wife. He ran towards her with open arms, but in the very next instant Axin bared her teeth and went straight for his throat. Sai shouted for him not to touch her, and at the same instant lunged forward and plunged his knife between her teeth, and without hesitation he sank the blade deep and finished her. Turning to check on Huang Tao, the man screamed in rage, brandishing a piece of wood at him, saying that he killed her, while Xiao, to protect himself, knocked him to the ground. Xiao remained calm, saying that he understood that he was suffering, but the Xin he knew was gone. She had turned into a zombie, and he had no choice as he was trying to keep the rest of them alive. Huang Tao staggered, his voice choked with pain and anger, and expressed that it was easy for him to say that, asking what would happen if he killed his family in front of him, asking if he would be able to remain so calm under those circumstances. These words hit Xiao like a slap, and his mind flashed back to his past life, where the bodies of his loved ones were piled up and soaked in blood. At that moment, with uncontrollable rage, he grabbed Huang by the neck and lifted him into the air as if he were a toy, his eyes becoming sharp as blades, mentioning that he was wasting his time there trying to resolve his suspicions, saving their asses time after time, and he still had to hear this kind of comment in return, saying that anyone who dared to touch his family would meet a fate crueler than anything else. At that moment, Linji, the one who deserved to be grabbed by the neck, broke the silence with a laugh, saying that maybe he wasn't so different from the monsters after all. At that instant, a hand struck Xiao's wrist, interrupting the blow, causing our protagonist to be thrown to the ground. At that moment, a familiar voice shouted, telling him to wake up, calling him an idiot. Standing before him was his older brother Ming, who then glared at Huang, who was still desolate with agony over losing his wife. Ming simply shouted, mentioning that he was smart enough to understand what his wife had become, mentioning that obviously no one wanted this, and that if his brother hadn't done what he did, he wouldn't even be there to mourn, asking him to pull himself together as he was a leader of this village, and the village needed him. Huang Tao trembled, clenching his fists, and finally gave a slow and painful nod. The tension finally dissipated, and at that instant, a faint scream echoed from the cave, calling for help, and it was the voice of the village chief. Zhao froze at that moment, as something didn't fit, thinking that the tone was too controlled, too human. One of Linji's thugs rolled his eyes and called everyone cowards, saying that he would go see what was going on in there. With that, he stepped into the cave in a few strides, dropped his flashlight, and those outside became alert. We see that his torso was split in half, blood spurting everywhere, and that furthermore, a gruesome zombie dragged one of his halves and casually tossed it aside like garbage. And behind it, hundreds of bright red eyes illuminated the darkness. In other words, the horde had awakened. What Xiao saw was far beyond what he had imagined, as the number of undead emerging from the cave was terrifying. And even if he could fight to escape, how could he protect both Xia Bingbing and his brother? Fortunately, the Zhou brothers had trained since childhood under a retired military martial arts master, and their skills were nothing short of elite, good enough to match professional fighters. Zhao then warned them to aim for the head, as they were sensitive to direct light. At that moment, all hell broke loose, and the brothers moved in perfect synchronization, striking and dodging, clearing the area in minutes. Parallel to this, we see that Linji had already hidden behind a tree, afraid even to breathe. From the depths of the cave, the same strange cry for help echoed again, while Xiao and Ming exchanged glances. Zhao then told everyone to leave, as things were going to get very heavy from that point on. Then, without hesitation, the two entered the darkness, and not far in, Xiao stopped abruptly. A corpse lay ahead, dried out like a husk, with its heart completely missing. That same voice called out again, whispering supernaturally through the air. Ming raised his flashlight, sweeping the cave, and there, sitting with his back to them, was the village chief. And then he turned sharply with a pale face and empty eyes, and from his chest, tentacles began to unfurl. The creature lunged at them with terrifying speed. Xiao reacted, striking his knife towards its head, but the moment the knife hit, he knew something was wrong, and that this was no ordinary zombie, but a mutant. In the next instant, tentacles whipped out and hurled our protagonist against the cave wall. Ming's flashlight beam hit the creature's face and it shrieked, recoiling violently from the light. Seizing the moment, they staggered out of the cave. Ming, desperate, asked Xiao what that thing was, and his younger brother replied that it was probably a cross-species infection, maybe some kind of genetic recombination between animals and humans, and that it wasn't just an undead, but something that had evolved from it. At that moment, bats began to fly out of the cave while that terrifying mutation followed, landing an extremely powerful blow on Ming, throwing him far away. At that moment, Xia grabbed one of its tentacles with bloodshot eyes and pulled with all his might, but it was useless as the monster's power was overwhelming, far beyond what any human could withstand. Just as the creature's jaws were about to close on Zhou Ming's hand, Xiao froze in helpless horror, and then, out of nowhere, a car sped into the scene. The door burst open, and behind the wheel was Xia Bingbing. She aimed without hesitation and ran over the mutant zombie, throwing it away. Xiao didn't miss the opportunity, lunging at the enemy and delivering the final blow. ending the creature's life once and for all. When they realized that the monster was actually the village chief, Xia Bingbing was visibly shaken. Ming exhaled deeply, his voice weary, saying that if she hadn't appeared at that moment, they both would be dead now. But before they could catch their breath, our protagonist's face paled, as he had noticed a clear bite mark on Ming's forearm. Ming then gave a weak smile and said he was sorry, as now Xiao would have to take care of the family alone, and as for what came next, he didn't even need to say it. These words pierced Xiao like a blade, because deep down, he already knew that he would have to be the one to end his brother's suffering. Looking at his infected brother, Xiao was overcome with guilt, as he believed that being reborn would give him the chance to change fate and protect his family, and he questioned why destiny was repeating itself. Suddenly, his eyes fixed on the mutant's corpse, and he rushed over and tore the blade from the creature's skull, then struck its head repeatedly. Ming, thinking his brother had gone mad, shouted, asking why Zhao was doing this, just as Xia Bingbing called out to him, trying to pull him back. However, Xiao didn't stop, because something had just occurred to him. He remembered that high-level zombies absorb viral energy from lower ones and condense it into a crystallized core hidden deep within their skulls. Moments later, he found it. A dark, blood-colored crystal nestled in the back of the creature's brain. He turned to Ming, his voice firm and eyes burning with hope, saying that he hadn't transformed yet, so there was still time, and with that, he held out the crystal. Xiu spoke in a heavy voice, saying that it was a zombie core, formed from concentrated viral matter. It shared the same source as what was in his body, saying that if he took it, there was a chance of evolving into an enhanced immune type. But there was also a chance of turning into one of those monsters. Ming barely glanced at it before swallowing it without hesitation, while Xiao, in turn, hesitated, but deep down, he knew this was their only chance. After swallowing it, Ming smiled, saying that he could have said that earlier, as it would have spared him the suffering he went through. With that, he asked when it would take effect, while Xiao replied that the results would be visible in 2 days. Ming nodded, turning towards the cave. 2 days. If I don't come out by then, seal it. But if I come out with superpowers, you'd better not be jealous. Watching his brother walk away so casually, our protagonist finally felt the weight on his chest lessen a bit, as he believed in him, and with a faint smile, he whispered that he would be waiting. However, no matter how difficult things are, there's always someone to make it worse. And hidden behind a nearby tree, Lin Ji was listening to the entire conversation, and a sinister smile spread across his face, thinking that he would speed up the process. The scene changed, and the next morning, as the sun began to rise, Ying entered Xiao's room wearing a kind of totally ridiculous battlesuit, saying it was time for him to wake up. Our protagonist turned his head and gave her a helpless look, saying that it looked like she was cosplaying some third-rate science fiction. Jung reminded him that he said they needed to step up their defenses, so she stayed up all night making this armor, asking if he thought it was cool, then waiting for compliments. At that moment, Zhao poked the armor with a finger, sending the poor girl rolling away. Xiao then asked if her trick was going to be playing bowling against a horde of zombies. Arriving outside, he observed that his father was building a huge fence around the house, and upon seeing his son, he jumped off the wall and picked up a nearby barrel of gunpowder, walking over with a huge smile, asking where he had gotten that. Xia sighed and replied to his father that it was gunpowder, not a toy, but Mr. Zhou had already slung the barrel over his shoulder, running off with a laugh, and watching his excited father, Xiao just asked him not to blow up the house. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the side yard. He turned and saw his mother, with a wok stuck on her head, brandishing a trident. He asked if breakfast was ready, but his mother replied that she didn't have time for that, because she needed to train. And our protagonist just sighed and thought that maybe it would be a good idea to go to Uncle Sang's to eat with him. At that moment, Xia Bingbing had been standing in front of Xiao's door for some time, about to ring the bell. When the door opened from the inside, Xiao came out surprised and asked what she was doing there. She lowered her head, hesitant, and then, as if gathering courage, she looked up and said loudly, I need your help with something. Xiao wondered what she needed, but at that instant, his mother also came to the door, and when she saw who it was, she smiled warmly, asking Xiao to come in, and she thanked her, saying that she wouldn't take long, as she was there to talk to Xiao. She turned to him, her tone serious, and said that the village committee had begun to organize defenses and that everything was going well so far. However, she had contacted the county police station last night, and since then, there had been no response. Xiao then quickly checked his phone and saw that it had no signal. And frowning, he thought that this was strange, as it hadn't happened last time. Xiao continued, saying that this didn't seem right and that if they were isolated, they could lose communication and wouldn't know if they would receive help or anything like that, then asking Xiao to go with her to the county, as she needed to find out what was going on. Xiao remained silent, clearly disturbed by what she had said, and noticing his hesitation, she apologized, mentioning that she felt terrible remembering what happened to his brother yesterday, and that even after all that, she was already putting him at risk again. However, she really needed to go to the county to find out what was happening, as it was her responsibility, and he was the best fighter she knew, as he understood these enemies better than anyone. At that moment, Xiao's mother intervened and gently interrupted, saying that was enough, because if it weren't for her yesterday, her son might not have returned. Furthermore, what happened to Ming was his own choice, and it wasn't her fault. With that, she asked Bing for a minute, as she wanted to talk to her son, and he followed her inside the house. Inside, she was quiet, rummaging through an old wooden shelf, and without turning around, she spoke softly, saying that his father and she were his parents, and that they shouldn't hold him back, and that they should protect him, not burden him. With that, she pulled out a long knife wrapped in an old cloth and gave it to him so that he could protect himself. At that moment, Xiao and Bing walked side by side, heading towards the county. Behind them, Xiao's mother stood quietly at the gate, watching until their figures disappeared into the distance. At that moment, a faint smile appeared on her face as she murmured to herself, saying that those two made a beautiful couple. The scene shifted, and we see that deep within the cave, Zhou Ming remained still, waiting for his body to react to the zombie core he had just swallowed. At that moment, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and thinking it was his brother, he simply pleaded for him not to come any closer yet. However, at that moment, he realized that something wrong wasn't right, as he felt his boots getting wet and saw a liquid running there. Upon putting his finger in it and inhaling, he realized it was gasoline, and before he could do anything, a massive explosion occurred in the cave. After that, the episode ended, and with that, the first part of this manhwa ends, and if you want the continuation, leave your like and your hype to strengthen the video, comment below that you want part 2, and consider subscribing and activating the bell so you don't miss any news.